Is Africa more important to the West than we realized? It's becoming increasingly clear who truly depends on whom, as African nations begin restricting Western access to their resources. The pressure is now being felt in the West. Recently, U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to cut foreign aid to Africa highlighted a major shift in global relations. Yet, instead of weakening the continent, this move has strengthened Africa's determination to achieve economic independence by focusing on self-reliance and building industries that add value within their borders. African nations are taking control of their future, no longer willing to be dictated to by foreign powers. But which countries are leading this movement, and what exactly are they doing? Let's take a closer look. For decades, Western economies have thrived on the assumption that Africa would continue supplying cheap raw materials to power their industries. From oil and gold to uranium and lithium, Africa's natural wealth has fueled everything, from Western transportation systems to technological innovation. Now, that dynamic is changing. In a historic shift, 10 African nations have introduced strict restrictions on the export of raw materials, ensuring that more of the value stays within the continent. This move is shaking global markets and forcing Western nations to confront an uncomfortable truth. Africa will no longer remain the world's raw material supplier. These policies represent far more than just economic reform. They are a bold declaration of African sovereignty. For generations, African resources have been extracted cheaply, processed abroad, and sold back at a premium to the very countries they came from. This exploitative cycle has deprived Africa of the full benefits of its wealth and hindered the development of strong, self-sufficient economies. Now, that pattern is being broken. The new export rules signal a profound shift in how African leaders view their role in the global economy. Take Ghana, for example, one of Africa's largest gold producers. The country has implemented a groundbreaking policy requiring mining companies to sell 20% of their refined gold directly to the Bank of Ghana. This initiative is designed to strengthen the nation's gold reserves and reduce reliance on foreign currencies that have historically made Ghana vulnerable to external economic shocks. By keeping more of its wealth at home, Ghana aims to achieve greater financial stability and independence. For years, most of Ghana's gold was exported in its raw form, allowing foreign refiners and corporations to capture most of the profits. Now, the new law requires that part of this gold be refined domestically, ensuring that local industries share in the benefits. This decision is not only economic, it's symbolic. Ghana is directly challenging a long-standing global system that forces African nations to export resources with minimal gains. At the heart of Ghana's new policy lies a critical question. Why should a gold-rich nation depend on foreign currencies to sustain its economy? For decades, Western corporations and economies have profited immensely from Ghana's undervalued gold exports. But with these new export restrictions, Ghana is sending a clear message. The era of cheap African resources is over. As a result, Western industries, especially in electronics and jewelry, are beginning to feel the effects of Africa's growing economic assertiveness. The nation is reclaiming control over its wealth, ensuring that its natural resources serve the interests of its people, rather than fueling foreign markets. By managing its gold reserves locally and keeping a larger share of the profits within its borders, Ghana is turning its mineral wealth into a foundation for long-term economic stability and prosperity. 2. Uganda's agricultural revolution. Uganda made a groundbreaking move that sent ripples through global agricultural markets. It banned the export of raw agricultural goods, including staples like tea and coffee. As one of Africa's top coffee producers, Uganda recognized the economic disadvantage of exporting unprocessed coffee beans that foreign companies would later refine and resell at massive profits. To correct this imbalance, Uganda shifted its focus toward exporting processed products, ensuring that more of the value generated by its coffee remains within the country. This strategic pivot is transforming Uganda's economy. It's driving the growth of a domestic processing industry that creates jobs, strengthens local businesses, and boosts national income. The logic is simple. Why should Ugandan farmers do the hard work of cultivation while foreign corporations take the lion's share of profits? To support this transformation, the government has invested heavily in local infrastructure, such as coffee roasting and processing plants, to increase the value of crops before they are exported. This move is redefining Uganda's position in the global coffee trade. Western coffee corporations, which have long depended on cheap, raw beans from Uganda, now face a difficult choice: either pay higher prices for processed coffee or find new suppliers. This policy shift is shaking global supply chains and forcing foreign businesses to adapt to a new reality, one where Africa holds greater control over the value of its products. By moving up the value chain, Uganda is strengthening its economic position, reducing dependence on volatile global commodities markets, and ensuring that the profits from its coffee production benefit Ugandan workers and enterprises. This transformation represents more than just an agricultural policy change. It challenges a long-standing global mindset that viewed African nations merely as suppliers of raw materials to more developed economies. Uganda is proving that it can compete on equal footing in the international coffee market, not just as a source of raw goods, but as an active market participant, capturing full value from its resources. With this shift, Uganda is redefining its economic identity and setting a precedent for other African nations seeking to transform their industries from resource providers to value creators. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comment section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. 3. Gabon's log export ban. A major transformation in Gabon's resource management strategy took place in 2010 when the nation banned the export of raw logs. Before this policy shift, Gabon's timber industry primarily served European and Asian markets, exporting raw logs that foreign companies would later process into furniture and finished wood products. It didn't take long for Gabonese leaders to recognize that most of the value generated from their timber was being captured abroad. While Gabon supplied the raw materials, foreign industries reaped the profits. This raised an essential question. If Gabon's timber is valuable enough to sustain foreign companies, shouldn't Gabon itself be the primary beneficiary? Driven by this realization, Gabon implemented a strict ban on raw log exports to encourage domestic processing and manufacturing. The results were transformative. The policy fueled the rise of local furniture making, carpentry, and other wood-based industries, diversifying the economy, creating jobs, and reducing reliance on a single export market. The effects rippled far beyond Gabon's borders. European furniture manufacturers, accustomed to importing cheap raw logs, faced new competition and had to adapt to a changing market, were suddenly forced to purchase processed wood products instead, significantly increasing their costs. This forced many companies to reassess their supply chains and acknowledge the true value of African resources. Gabon's model has since inspired other African nations, proving the economic and social benefits of local value addition. But this move represents more than just a change in trade policy. It's a statement of sovereignty. By prioritizing domestic development over foreign convenience, Gabon is redefining what it means to manage national wealth. The country's success challenges the outdated notion that African nations must remain low-value exporters, showing instead that they can control, process, and profit from their own resources. 4. Niger's uranium export restriction. Following a recent shift in government, Niger made a bold decision to restrict uranium exports, particularly to France, a move that sent shockwaves through global energy markets. For decades, Niger's uranium has been the backbone of France's nuclear energy industry, sold at prices that overwhelmingly favored French interests. But as global uranium prices surged, Niger's new leadership took a stand. No longer would its resources be exploited and undervalued for the benefit of foreign economies. This policy shift exposed an uncomfortable truth. Despite claims of energy independence, France's nuclear sector, which provides much of its electricity, is heavily dependent on African uranium. As Niger tightened its export policies, France faced rising energy costs and potential shortages, revealing how fragile Western self-sufficiency truly is. Yet Niger's move is far more than an economic maneuver. It's a powerful assertion of sovereignty. By taking ownership of its uranium, Niger is forcing European nations to renegotiate long-standing, one-sided agreements. The decision is reshaping Western energy markets, which had grown complacent with access to cheap African resources. The broader message is unmistakable. African nations will no longer provide vital resources without fair compensation. This marks a turning point in global energy dynamics. African resources are now being recognized not merely as commodities for export, but as strategic assets essential for global stability and Africa's own economic growth. France's reaction to Niger's uranium restrictions has laid bare the depth of Western dependence on African minerals, underscoring a global interdependence that has been ignored for far too long. 5. Guinea's food export ban. In a decisive move to safeguard its citizens amid surging global food prices, Guinea has restricted the export of essential crops such as rice, maize, and yams. For decades, these staples were shipped abroad, often leaving local markets understocked and vulnerable to price volatility. Today, Guinea's new policy sends a clear message. The well-being of its people comes before the demands of international markets. This measure reflects more than a temporary response to rising prices. It marks a fundamental shift in Guinea's economic priorities. The government is choosing food security over profit, ensuring that its agricultural wealth sustains Guineans first. As global supply chains tighten, this policy reinforces Guinea's commitment to self-sufficiency and stability during international crises. Why should Guinea's fertile lands feed wealthier nations while its own citizens face shortages? By retaining a larger share of its staple crops, Guinea is taking control of its destiny and rejecting the notion that African resources exist primarily to serve the world's consumption needs. The ripple effects are already being felt internationally. Western importers, long dependent on cheap African food supplies, are now facing rising costs and reduced availability. Guinea's stance is disrupting traditional trade patterns, but also redefining them, showing that African nations will no longer sacrifice domestic welfare for global convenience. This bold policy underscores a broader African awakening, a growing determination to protect local interests and ensure long-term food independence. Guinea's decision positions the country as a leader in agricultural sovereignty, setting an example for other nations seeking to reclaim control over their food systems. 6. Mozambique's timber reform. Following Gabon's example, Mozambique implemented a ban on raw timber exports in 2017, mandating that all wood products be processed domestically. This landmark decision represents a strategic effort to boost local industries, create jobs, and keep profits within the country. Previously, Mozambique exported vast quantities of raw logs to foreign markets, especially in Europe and Asia, where companies would process and sell them at much higher margins. By keeping the processing stage local, Mozambique is ensuring that the value of its natural resources contributes directly to national development rather than enriching external economies. If Western nations truly support Africa's development, shouldn't they welcome policies that build African industries rather than depend on raw exports? However, not all international partners have embraced the shift. Many Western companies, accustomed to cheap, unprocessed timber, now face higher costs and fewer sourcing options. While these changes may disrupt established supply chains, they also signify Mozambique's firm commitment to reshaping its economic destiny. This policy is not merely an economic adjustment. It's a declaration of independence from the exploitative trade systems of the past. Mozambique is rejecting the low-value role that has long been assigned to African nations and asserting its right to climb the global value chain. By prioritizing domestic growth and industrialization over the convenience of foreign markets, Mozambique is setting a powerful precedent. The message is unmistakable. Africa's natural wealth should no longer leave the continent without first serving its own people. 7. Namibia's lithium restrictions. As global demand for lithium surges with the rise of electric vehicles and renewable technologies, Namibia has seized the opportunity to take control of one of the world's most sought-after resources. Rather than allowing raw lithium to be exported cheaply, the Namibian government has restricted exports to encourage the growth of domestic processing industries and secure a stronger position in the green technology market. For decades, Western automakers and tech companies have relied on low-cost lithium imports from Africa to power their production lines. Now, they face a new reality: either invest locally or pay higher prices elsewhere. If the West is truly committed to sustainability, shouldn't Namibia's move be celebrated as a step toward fairer global practices? Instead, Western corporations are scrambling to adapt as Namibia's policy reshapes global supply chains and forces negotiations on African terms. This decision is not just economic, it's strategic and visionary. Namibia is redefining what resource sovereignty looks like in the era of clean energy. By maintaining control over its lithium production, Namibia ensures that the benefits of the Green Revolution are shared within Africa, not siphoned away by foreign interests. With this move, Namibia has established itself as a key player in the sustainable energy market and a model for other nations determined to turn natural wealth into national strength. Ivory Coast's cocoa control. As the world's largest cocoa producer, the Ivory Coast has long been the backbone of the global chocolate industry. Yet for decades, it has received only a fraction of the profits. Western chocolate companies have traditionally purchased raw cocoa beans at low prices, refined them abroad, and sold finished chocolate at massive markups. To challenge this imbalance, the Ivory Coast has introduced restrictions on the export of unprocessed cocoa beans, focusing instead on developing its domestic chocolate industry. This initiative creates jobs, retains value within the country, and strengthens the local economy. Why should the Ivory Coast, the very heart of the world's cocoa production, remain on the sidelines of the chocolate industry it sustains? By retaining more of the processing work at home, the Ivory Coast is forcing global chocolate manufacturers to pay fairer prices or invest in local operations. This shift not only disrupts an industry that has long relied on African underpricing, but also sends a clear message about economic dignity and fairness. The Ivory Coast Doctrine asserts that Africa deserves a fair share of the wealth generated by its own resources. This policy compels the global chocolate industry to finally acknowledge the nation's critical role in its success. The Democratic Republic of the Congo's copper and cobalt stand. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC holds some of the world's richest reserves of copper and cobalt, minerals vital to electronics, renewable energy, and electric vehicles. For decades, these minerals were exported in raw form, allowing Western manufacturers to capture nearly all of the profits. Now, the DRC is changing the narrative. The government has introduced export restrictions on unprocessed copper and cobalt, demanding that these resources be refined and processed locally. Why should the DRC continue to power global tech giants while its own economy remains underdeveloped? This shift represents a major turning point. By building local refining capacity, the DRC aims to create jobs, retain wealth, and move up the global value chain. Western tech companies, long dependent on cheap Congolese minerals, must now adapt to higher costs and more complex supply networks. The implications go far beyond the mining sector. The DRC's policy is reshaping the entire global supply chain for green and digital technologies, signaling that Africa's resources will no longer be exploited without fair return. In claiming control over its copper and cobalt exports, the DRC is no longer just a supplier. It has become a strategic player in the global energy transition. This stance highlights a broader continental awakening. Africa's wealth is not for exploitation, but for empowerment and equitable development. Zimbabwe's chrome ban. In a decisive move to reclaim control over its resources, Zimbabwe, one of the world's largest producers of chrome, has banned the export of raw chrome. This bold policy aims to stimulate domestic processing industries and ensure that the nation captures a greater share of the value from its own minerals. For years, Zimbabwe's raw chrome was exported cheaply, fueling foreign industries and boosting profits abroad, while contributing little to the local economy. But those days are over. By restricting exports, Zimbabwe is declaring that its wealth will no longer serve as raw material for others' prosperity. Why should Zimbabwe remain just a supplier when it can become a manufacturer? The government has invested heavily in local smelting and refining facilities, creating jobs and ensuring that chrome products gain value before they reach international markets. This approach has disrupted global supply chains, particularly in Western nations that relied on Zimbabwe's inexpensive raw chrome. Prices have risen, and companies are being forced to rethink their sourcing strategies. Zimbabwe's stand is part of a broader continental shift toward resource sovereignty. African nations are rejecting the outdated model that keeps them at the bottom of the global value chain. By building its own chrome industry, Zimbabwe sends a clear message: Africa will no longer sell its future for cheap. This policy positions Zimbabwe as a leader in Africa's new economic awakening, proving that true independence means control over one's own natural wealth. The ripple effects are global. Western economies, long dependent on Africa's low-cost exports, are now confronting a new reality where Africa sets the terms. Together, these 10 African nations are doing more than disrupting global supply networks. They are rewriting Africa's economic story. For too long, the continent has been treated as a source of raw materials for the world's prosperity. Now, it's demanding a seat at the table. By asserting control over their resources, these countries are ensuring that Africa's wealth benefits Africans first. The world is witnessing a transformation, one where Africa is no longer a passive participant in global trade, but an active architect of its own destiny. The impact is being felt everywhere. Western corporations face rising costs and tighter supply chains, while African nations gain leverage, stability, and confidence. This isn't just about economics. It's about dignity, justice, and self-determination. Should the West beg for these exports now? Why not build partnerships based on fairness and mutual growth? Why must Africa always be the one exploited? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We're exploring the rich history, culture, and ongoing struggle for sovereignty across Africa. If you believe in this movement, subscribe and turn on notifications, because staying informed means standing for change. Together, we can spread awareness, inspire empowerment, and reclaim Africa's rightful place in the global economy. Thanks for watching.